Trex,
Omar.
we are back with a dual episode of Iron Culture, and this episode has been in the making for almost 4 years.
Yeah, we've been talking about it every week, kind of continuing to put the storyboard together. And 4 years in, I think we're ready.
Yeah. It's like, Francis Ford Coppola recently released what he regards as his magnum opus, Megapolis. And it took just years and years. He had to sell some of his wine company in order to, really fund the passion project he had. And this is kind of similar because people might not be aware of this. We've mentioned it several times, both before Trex was an official host of Iron Culture, when you'd be a guest. But Trex moderated a pain science roundtable on my YouTube channel back when I was posting content, because it was a very popular topic, the whole idea of pain narratives, catastrophizing pain. What does pain mean? In fact, it almost took us 40 minutes to define that. In that conversation, we had several different people on there. There's Dr. Mike Israetel, Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum, Dr. Eric Trexler. Also another, I am forgetting the name, I think Dr. Derek, I want to say. There was another individual. I apologize. I sincerely apologize. But what ended up happening, so I brought Trex on board because I wanted someone else to moderate in case, they went into the weeds when it comes to science, and then Trex having that requisite knowledge can kind of rein it in if necessary. But Trex, what happened? You were side by side, and then all of a sudden, just as soon as they started defining what pain is or attempting to do so, it took about 30 or 40 minutes, you dropped out. Not you didn't choose to drop out, but it's almost like the ephemeral, once again, they didn't want you to participate due to what you potentially had to say.
So in all seriousness, I never before or after that had a similar issue with that particular hardware or software. And I do find it interesting that when people have dangerous ideas, these things tend to happen, and they're not able to share those in the appropriate avenues. So I can't say who was behind it, but I think it's very unusual that for exactly 1 hour of my life, all of a sudden that particular setup was not working for me. And I don't know how people got to it in terms of potential sabotage, but it certainly didn't pass the eye test for me. It looked fishy. It smelled fishy. I conclude that it's fishy.
Now, and Trex, that's why we have brought you back for this episode about pain science. I don't even need to hear anything you have to say on it to know it's going to be a monster episode, because we've been storyboarding, as you said, for almost 4 years. Right before we begin, however, I do want to talk about your origins as it relates to like pain science, your interest in it, your own personal story, kind of that episode we had before. I do want to read you, however, a review from iTunes, because the lovely folks that listen to Iron Culture, they're still dropping the reviews. It's about one a week, at least on the website that I see here. And I want you, Trex, just to react to it, because we're going to start positive, okay? They try to keep you out, but you're back better than ever. This review, I want you to react to it. So title, Rock Hard Content, 5 out of 5, by Mark the Asian Atheist is the name. Now, keep in mind, you can leave a rating review on Apple iTunes. We're not promoting Apple or iTunes. It's just the way that it kind of seems to consolidate all of these reviews. I don't think, like as an example, Spotify has the equivalent. Anyways, okay. So this person, Trex, has an updated review. Doc Helms, Sir Esoph, and the new Doc Trex make for a delightful trio, bringing everything in fitness culture into the conversation each week. There's a delectable blend of existential dread and practical knowledge from the latest in scientific literature, whether they are in the weeds in nuanced research reviews or standing atop the pyramid discussing the evolving zeitgeist of modern physical culture. This trio brings it hard every time. Aesthetic, dense, pulsing with quality information and banter.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It almost feels like ChatGPT threw that one together. Excellent vocabulary, very skewed toward the positive rather than the negative, personalized shout outs, no attempt to divide the group and sow any type of discord among us. So I give that rating of 5 stars.
Trex, I'm so glad that we're doing a duo now, just because our good friend Doc Helms, as Mark said, that's not a positive enough review for him. Folks heard probably about 10 episodes back. I read him a literal 5-star review where it was 95% positive. And I forget, there's one, I would call it like a neutral comment. And Eric spent the next 10 minutes basically rationalizing to himself how it's okay, how the world's not going to end. So I'm glad I could read. I personally, like, that is a glowing review. Thank you so much, Mark. We were so
And
back. Yeah.
honestly, with Helms, the 10-minute part is what we heard out loud. That was probably in his head for 10 days.
Yeah. That is the beginning. He was on the precipice of something for 10 whole days.
Yeah.
I was wondering why his hair was disheveled the next time that we saw him, where he was just like sleepless nights. Like he had that veneer of everything was okay when we saw him. And I said, "Hey man, how you doing?" And he said, "Good." But he'd been practicing saying "good" like that about 50 times in the mirror before that episode. Trex. That makes sense. But let's talk about you, man. Let's talk about your lore a little bit, because we are talking about pain science today. Kind of not only like your point of view, but maybe just giving some greater context. We've had maybe 3 episodes. The round table was on my channel, so maybe it might only be 2 or 3 on Iron Culture. So you can go ahead and listen to those previous episodes. But really, I'm wondering the origins for your interest, Trex, in pain science, because you did detail for yourself, not that this is related whatsoever, but like your own training history, some of the setbacks or injuries, let's say, accrued over time. But what people might not, really remember, Trex, is that you were a bouncer for a period in your career. And I'm just wondering, one of the few pop culture references that we all bonded over was Roadhouse. And there is a character in Roadhouse that says something I think kind of curious. Dalton, the supposedly character, they had to cut Trex's role because he disagreed strongly with something that Dalton said in that episode. I'm wondering if that's the origin of your interest in pain science or what's going on. He's getting stapled because, again, he's a bouncer. He's the cooler, but things still get hot, knife wounds, so on and so forth. He's interacting with the doctor, and she asked, does it hurt? Like, being stapled, stitched, all those sorts of things. And he replies, because he was studying philosophy, Trex, and when asked what philosophy he was studying, he said, man's search for meaning or some shit like that. He turns to her very stoically, and he says, pain don't hurt much. And I'm just wondering, was that the origin for you, Trex? Like, what is, like, just set us up, your interest in pain science, how you got into this, because I think some people are unaware. This isn't just like a topic, like, like a mass research review, like, oh, okay, like we're taking a look at ABC. Let me review this literature. This is something that you've spent some time actually investigating.
Yeah, I think, my interest in pain started out, like you said, as a bouncer after administering so much of it and wondering, what is this that I'm, doling out on the regular basis here? No, I mean, pain is interesting because anyone who's been in the iron game for more than a year or two, has some relationship to it, I would say. Certainly, the more years you add up, the likelihood that you will either experience some type of training related pain that goes beyond traditional or typical soreness, or you'll experience some type of pain or injury outside of the gym that will then modify the way that you're able to train for some period of time. So um, if you commit to a multi-decade lifting career, there will be instances of pain and most likely training accommodations based on that pain experience. And I think one of the things that really got me very interested in pain science is, not to belabor the point. I don't want every time we talk about pain for it to be a sob story for me. But one of the things that really got me interested in pain science is, when I was a kid, I'd have injuries, I'd come back, heal up, get back onto the field, no big deal. But I have been dealing with a more chronic pain issue, which has been going on for 7 years now, which is, needless to say, not my typical experience with sport-related injury. And this was the first like real substantial injury or chronic pain issue I had had since I got involved in science, actually doing scientists. So you kind of start looking at everything a little bit differently once you've been steeped in science for a while. And, I started reflecting on some of my prior experiences with pain and injury. And I did come across some really fascinating observations that kind of get into some of the models that we're going to talk about today with regards to pain. But a great example of this was I was doing a football camp in high school, American football, real football. And it was like the type of thing, it was 3 practices a day. You're staying at the college dorms, just kind of football all day, every day. And the evening of the first day, I rolled over my shoulder in a kind of awkward way. I go over to the trainer, who was, I think, in training, maybe not necessarily licensed yet. And they say, okay, you have a strained pec, and I think you should keep on playing and do your thing. And I said, okay. And it still hurt, but I was like, okay, but they said it's a strained pec, and how much could a strained pec actually hurt, objectively speaking, right? And so I kind of kept playing through it. And at the end of the camp, my mother takes one look at me. I was still in high school, and she says, "What happened to you?" And I said, "Oh, I strained my pec, actually." I fully believed the diagnosis and was experiencing my pain accordingly. It hurt like hell, but I just convinced myself, like, oh, I guess maybe I'm kind of a baby. But it's not like the pain went away. It hurt, but being told it's just a pec strain made me say, okay, well, it hurts a lot, but no big deal. It'll get better in the coming days. Omar, would you believe me if I told you that I had a broken collarbone and a separated shoulder? So my AC joint was separated and the clavicle was broken. And the reason my mom was so alarmed was because when she picked me up, I didn't have my shirt on. It was summer, sports, all that stuff. And my right nipple was 2 inches below my left nipple because my right shoulder was just falling apart. So it was interesting to me, though, that I felt that if they had told me on the first day, dude, you have a separated shoulder and a broken clavicle, I feel like the experience would have been a lot different because there would be so much uncertainty introduced and so much concern about, what am I going to do about this baseball tournament that I have in 4 weeks, So it's really interesting to look back at certain pain experiences and try to suss out how much is psychological, how much is biological or physiological. Now, I will tell you that another major injury I had, aside from a tremendous series of concussions, was I experienced a tear in my sacroiliac joint, or my sacroiliac ligament, which, covers the sacroiliac joint, as a wrestler. And that was brutally painful. It got to the point where I wrestled at least a couple tournaments from my knee instead of actually getting into a wrestling stance because I couldn't, right? So I would just be kind of like knuckles and knees, just kind of like a menace crawling around out there. And I was like, well, I signed up for the tournament, might as well show up anyway. And one of the things that really blew me away about that injury was kind of the opposite, where I could tell with that shoulder one, the tremendous impact of psychology and just having even the fake confidence, oh, it's just a pec strain, actually did kind of matter. But then with the sacroiliac joint, I was convinced I'm fine. And they're like, actually, you're kind of not. So what we're going to do is give you a corticosteroid injection straight into that sacroiliac ligament. And the relief came in a matter of 2 days. And I was wrestling in a comfortable stance and, it wore off over time. But it just kind of showed me the tremendous impact of just kind of the pure biology of if we go in and do this really targeted intervention, we can actually induce virtually immediate relief, which took my pain when wrestling from a 9 out of 10 to a 2, it was really tremendous. So pain is something that, it's always kind of there if you're an athlete. And in today's episode, I wanted to talk through a couple popular models of how we understand pain. And I'm going to tell it from the talk about it from the perspective of a lifter, because this is iron culture after all. And the reason I want to talk about this is because some of the chatter I've seen online in the evidence-based fitness space is embracing, I don't want to say new, but newer than hundreds of years old models of pain. Um, and and that's good because these models that have come within the last several decades are upgrades from the model that essentially is attributed to Descartes hundreds of years ago. So that's good. We should probably update models at least every couple hundred years. But one of the things that I notice in this chatter online is that it seems like there are misunderstandings that are fairly pervasive about how exactly to interpret some of these newer models, and more importantly, how we might actually go about applying them. So I felt like it was worthwhile, as we've talked a little bit about my current injury and more of a chronic pain scenario rather than an acute pain scenario, kind of talking through where I think evidence-based fitness is on the money with these types of discussions and where I think a lot of people tend to miss the mark.
Correct. I personally cannot wait for this episode. That's why I said, before you said anything, it's a monster episode because just in general, I highly respect how methodical you are. There's a reason why I asked you to moderate that, let's call it, I hate always phrasing it like debate, right? Like that, the pain science roundtable or like whatnot, the conversation, just due to all your writing previously on the topic, but also other things. And I know there is a lot to be said. And I think it's very interesting. I like how you weaved your own personal story into some of that. So please, the floor is yours. Pain science. It's more complicated than you think. Let's hear it.
Yeah, well, first I want to define pain. And if you could give me the floor for 30, 40 minutes, I think. So, no, I actually do want to define pain. And I want to make a point in doing it. I think a lot of folks in fitness, in evidence-based fitness, usually evidence-based fitness is on the cutting edge of things, right? We were the first people who decided BCAAs are dumb, right? And so then everyone wanted to go around telling everyone BCAAs are dumb, and we're the ones who found out in like 2013 or something, right? I think one of the pieces of chatter that I notice when pain is discussed in evidence-based fitness is like, we've got this brand new thing, this new set of theories and this new way of looking at pain that none of these dummies in the medical world know about. And I'm not trying to attribute that to any particular individual. Again, I'm just talking about, in the game of telephone, by the time it gets 11 layers down and it's just broad chatter on the internet, I do think that there's, I think sometimes people are excessively dismissive of the kind of, big medicine apparatus that they have no idea what's going on out there. So to prove a point, I've got a textbook here, Omar, and this was published, I believe, in 2011. And you know that by the time something gets to a textbook, it's basically old news, right? It's the people already had the debates about it, the arguments, all the original research has been considered pretty set at that point by the time something gets into a textbook. And this was actually written by a guy, this textbook that I know from my old university. And this guy's about to retire. I think he might have actually already retired. So this is not like the 33-year-old up-and-comer young buck with some radical ideas, right? This is a guy who about 35 years into his career was publishing this textbook in 2011, all right? It says, pain can be defined as an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage or described in terms of such damage. So one of the big misconceptions in evidence-based fitness is like, we all figured out like 3 years ago, something that medicine didn't know, because this is an athletic training textbook. And that is that there are distinctions between pain and actual tissue damage, and that pain is a sensory experience that also incorporates emotion, right? It is not as simple as what we might call the Cartesian model attributed to Descartes a zillion years ago, which is the very simplistic idea that, the body is just pure basic stimulus response when it comes to tissue damage equaling pain. So the idea was, if I damage tissue, then there will be a proportional response in terms of perceived pain that is directly linked and extremely, tightly linked to the degree of tissue damage that occurs. And that is pretty much the entirety of the complexity involved in the relationship. Now, sometimes people call this, instead of the Cartesian model, I've seen people call it the biomedical model. And I think that reinforces this misconception that the current biomedical science apparatus has no idea about these newer models of pain. And like I said, this definition of pain provided in this textbook is not teaching it as a fringe idea and then saying, but here's the real hard science definition of pain. These are pretty acknowledged, pretty embraced ideas in fields. And again, this is athletic training as a textbook. This isn't neurosurgery. This isn't a textbook dedicated to pain science. And so this has already trickled its way down to the kind of allied health professions, let alone kind of mainstream biomedical science, right? So I think it's really important to give clinicians a little bit of credit that I think people kind of gloss over. The section here continues, pain is a subjective sensation with more than one dimension and an abundance of descriptors in its qualities and characteristics. It's composed of a variety of human discomforts rather than being a single entity. The perception of pain can be subjectively modified by past experiences and expectations. So this stuff that we've been treating as completely novel, radical ideas, this stuff has been around for a minute. And I think it's important to give people a little bit of credit for that. But most importantly, aside from deciding, whether or not these ideas are brand new and novel in evidence-based fitness, I think the more important thing is, what are the most useful models we can use for actually conceptualizing pain? So I think these types of definitions are very, very helpful in terms of alluding to some of the models that we should be leaning on. Because when we talk about a sensory and emotional experience, that does not sound like the Cartesian model of disrupted tissue that messes with the pain receptors, which send the pain message to the pain part of the brain, and it's a perfectly proportional response 100% of the time, right? Clearly, there's other stuff going on here impacted by emotion, expectations, past experiences, and that's really important. And another thing that's worth noticing, a lot of people rightly point out in evidence-based fitness that it's kind of an oversimplification to call something a pain receptor. A more appropriate term would be nociceptors, and this textbook acknowledges that nociceptors are sensitive to mechanical, thermal, and chemical energy. So we have many different types of noxious stimuli, or what in some academic settings you might call an insult to these nociceptors, and they send that message of some insult or noxious stimulus. They send that kind of back up the nervous system, ultimately to higher centers where we can kind of interpret that signal. And that's a good thing because, one of the things that when people get a little bit too into this idea that pain is purely psychological and emotional and based on past experience and narratives we tell ourselves, you don't have to teach anyone that a stove is hot for them to remove their hand from it, right? These nociceptors pick up on that thermal stimulus, and we perceive that as pain without any prior narrative about what pain is or what threat that flame or cooking surface represents to us. These things work in the absence of narratives, but they can be impacted by narratives as well. Okay, so before I get too far into some of the details on this, I want to address two really important models that are valuable in the evidence-based fitness world. One of them is the biopsychosocial model. Now, I mentioned that the Cartesian model is sometimes also referred to as the biomedical model. And obviously, it's very biologically heavy, very physiology focused. Biopsychosocial expands that and directly acknowledges the psychological and sociological factors that can influence pain perception. right? And so that's really important. And I think psychological factors, people generally they don't need much elaboration to wrap their head around that, right? If you are really worried about a particular, simplest example I can think of is a little kid, right? Little kid falls and they get a boo-boo on their knee. Do the parents laugh or do they panic? If they laugh, maybe the kid doesn't cry. If they panic and they look stressed and worried, the kid cries, right? It's like when you're walking around with a toddler and they're still trying to get their legs underneath them, the way you respond to their little boo-boos and incidents, it actually does. The kids, it kind of plants the psychological element in their head that says, oh, crap, so whatever just happened was pretty bad and I ought to be pretty worried about it. And then the tears really start to come, right? The social elements, I think one of the most intuitive, one of the most intuitive examples to me is just like, Omar, you've probably been around a bunch of salty old power lifters who are in there, they've been powerlifting for decades. And it's like every time they get out of a chair, they're grumbling. If you're hanging out at a group of folks who's constantly talking about how their training is beating up their body and wear and tear is kind of a catchphrase that's used all the time in that type of group, even your social setting can start kind of reminding you, hey, maybe your knees are feeling a little bit creaky since squat day was yesterday, right? Maybe your hips are feeling tight from those deadlifts the other day. So there are these psychological and sociological factors that can absolutely influence how we perceive pain. And kind of one of the buzzwords that I think is useful is the idea of pain narratives, right? So narratives being just the stories we tell ourselves about what this pain is and what it really means to us, right? So for example, when I was at football camp, my pain narrative was I strained my pec. So I still felt a unusually high level of pain. I could tell in the moment, this is way more painful than I would ever expect a strained pec to be. But at the same time, my narrative was, Omar, I was like 15. I was at a football camp. We hadn't heard the term toxic masculinity yet. I was thinking, if I show the amount of pain I'm feeling and I have a strained pec, I'm going to be so embarrassed, right? So like I was, for better or for worse, my pain narrative was you're being a baby, you're overreacting, don't show that pain, and you're fine. And I think that my reaction to that injury certainly would have been different if I truly understood the severity of it in the moment. I probably would have made smarter decisions about maybe not playing football with it. But nonetheless, these narratives, these stories we tell ourselves about what this pain is, where it comes from, a pec strain, what it represents, nothing. Pec strains heal, no big deal. Don't do push-ups for a couple weeks, you'll be all right, versus, oh crap, broken clavicle, separated shoulder. I hope it heals well. Sometimes they don't heal in a particularly good, sometimes the shoulder doesn't line back up the way you want it to. I have a baseball tournament in 4 weeks. I let my team down. They're going to be really unhappy with me. That's my throwing shoulder. Am I still going to be able to throw in 8 weeks? You start to run through, you start to catastrophize a little bit. You run through a completely different set of scenarios once you've been led to believe that this is a more serious thing than it is. Now, it's easy to go back and determine which of those narratives is more rational or more accurate after the fact. But the reality is a lot of lifters, when they're having some type of pain experience, they do not currently know what it is with any high level of certainty, and they may never know. I'm sure we've all done one of two things. And one is I have something that hurts, I train through it or around it, and then eventually it stops hurting, which is great. That's fantastic. Best case scenario. But we never actually find out in the entire trajectory of that what it was. Another thing is, you go to the doctor and you say, my back kind of hurts when I put 600 pounds on it. And the doctor says, I have great news. You don't have to put 600 pounds on your back. So just don't do that. And like sometimes they just don't take you all that seriously. They may do imaging, which may not be helpful at all. But more often than not, you kind of walk away and saying, I don't really know exactly what that pain was. So those are scenarios where the narratives that we tell ourselves, that we come up with without any kind of confirmatory diagnosis, they really do dictate a large percentage of how we interpret that pain experience in the moment and how we carry that information forward. So perhaps if we notice pain in the front of the knee after a squat session that didn't go super well, maybe we've planted a seed in our head that when I squat, my knee hurts. Or maybe we even plant a seed. One of the really common unfavorable pain narratives out there is I've got a bum knee, and therefore squatting will never be on the menu for me again in any capacity. Now, I would imagine there are some people out there with serious enough knee issues that perhaps they would be well advised to avoid, externally loaded squatting. I'm not a clinician. What do I know? But I'm sure you could find me a knee messed up enough that maybe squatting's not in the cards. But for a lot of folks will just say, I played football in high school, so I can never squat again. Well, there's a lot of people that played football in high school, and a lot of them still squat, right? So the biopsychosocial model helps us understand some of these more nuanced elements of pain. Another model that pairs really well with it is called the fear avoidance model of pain. And so it builds on this idea that there are these kind of psychological and these non-biological inputs to how we process different pain narratives and put them together. The idea with the fear avoidance model is it kind of carries that forward. And so we have a pain experience. We build a particularly extreme pain narrative around it that leads to catastrophizing and fear of certain movement. And what can be really tricky about that is, logically it makes sense. As someone who somehow finds himself in a department of evolutionary anthropology, it makes sense that if you have an unpleasant, painful experience, you would say, okay, maybe not do that again. You can kind of work out from an evolutionary perspective why we might be inclined to build some of these catastrophizing pain narratives. The problem there is very intuitively, when we build that narrative, sometimes it's not super logical. Sometimes it's an exaggeration of reality. And we can convince ourselves that it's in our best interest to avoid certain movements entirely. Now, if we do that, depending on what movements we're avoiding, we could potentially experience weakness or detraining that puts us in a position where our body is physiologically just less robust, and perhaps we're opening the door to even greater disability or pain in the future from a state of detraining. Like, I know a lot of times people who have been locked into their training for years on end, that hits the ear wrong. They think if I took 3 years off of training, I'd feel like $1 million. And it's because they're measuring that or kind of extrapolating that based on how do I feel the last day of a brutal training cycle and how do I feel 7 days later after a vacation. And during that 7-day time frame, you feel like $1 million, from day 1 to day 7. But as someone who's been sidelined from training for an extended period of time, you start to get that old person stuff where you're just like, I just woke up today and my knees hurt. And it's not because I was squatting, because I haven't been. Like you start to notice that disuse does absolutely lead to reduced ability, increased pain perception in some instances. And so what we find is that you can potentially reinforce the pain that you're experiencing because you are so fearful of movement that you are detraining and ultimately making your body a little bit less resilient in many different ways. So the fear avoidance model would suggest that after a pain experience, a more productive, more helpful route forward is to actually confront that pain experience and kind of target, the rehabilitation and re-strengthening process head on so that you focus more on recovery rather than avoidance moving forward. So I want to give a shout out here. These ideas of the biopsychosocial model, the fear avoidance model, these were largely unknown to the evidence-based fitness world, even though they were, hiding in some of these textbooks. And I think the folks at Barbell Medicine really led the charge, or at least they're the people that I associate with really popularizing some of these models and ideas and making them well known to people. And I want to be clear that I think that that is a very good thing. I think that the folks at Barbell Medicine do great work. I think it's important that we as a lifting community caught up to speed with some of these theories and models. So I think that's a fantastic thing, and I'm firmly of the belief that we should be viewing pain from a biopsychosocial perspective. And I also think that fear-based avoidance of movement, if taken to the extreme, can actually exacerbate rather than improve scenarios of chronic pain. So my concern is that people may listen to this episode as I move into the second phase here and think that I'm like taking a shot at the Barbell Medicine folks. Couldn't be further from the truth. But what I will say is when people talk about nuanced topics as content creators, sometimes it starts a game of telephone, kind of a chain reaction. And regardless of how the individual presented that information, the message can get a little bit distorted as it goes from one level to the next, to the next, to the next, right? And so all of a sudden you can find scenarios where people are discussing something in a way that isn't really in alignment with the underpinned theory that drives it. So sometimes the discussion can stray away from the theory that underpins that model. And sometimes you can find some pretty egregious misinterpretations and even misapplications of some of these ideas once they get out into the world and they start bouncing around conversations and get modified a little bit, misheard a little bit, misstated a little bit. And a great example of that is, I'm in Herman Pontzer's lab here at Duke University. And, Herman Pontzer, he's written books and papers about exercise energy compensation. And, the main takeaway is that, there's a nonlinear relationship between physical activity level and total daily energy expenditure. And at the upper levels of total physical activity, it looks like there's some constraint that keeps total energy expenditure within a particular range. And we also, he and we acknowledge that exercise is maybe the best thing you could do for your health across the board, but that as a standalone weight loss intervention, it generally doesn't tend to be very effective. And there's numerous clinical trials that bear that out. But after that game of telephone kind of works its way down the line, I'll hear people who come back to me and say, "So you really believe that athletes don't burn more calories than people who barely move throughout the day?" Of course, I don't believe that. I mean, we can look at the data, and I mean, there's ample evidence to refute that. And people say, "So you mean to tell me that there's no reason anyone should do exercise?" Of course not. Who would say such a thing? No, absolutely not. So I've seen how, you have this really elegant, well put together theory, the model behind it, everything fits together really well. And as it gets relayed down the line, it starts to kind of fall apart. And so what I want to address moving forward is just a few really big misconceptions or misapplications of these ideas.
Rex, like I said, man, I'm already loving this episode. And to steal, man, to your point, use something Helms would say. I'm channeling the presence of Helms here right now. And to give respect to Barbell Medicine, I want to set the scene kind of for like 2015, 2016. You jokingly saying like, this has been in a textbook for quite some time. But like the general conversations, you would see people, either the content mill tricks of people, like let's say either not physiotherapists, but people just producing content, saying, hey, your knee's bothering you. Here's 3 quick fixes. And it always would kind of rely a little bit more on the structural component. Like you do these 3, it's like a setup, a problem, and then a solution. And it's kind of like a linear path of like a declarative statement. You do these things and like, well, your back pain, this is the cause and this is the solution. And so not at all that they were reactionary, but let's say once I think this very necessary update in the evidence-based community, then some of the people that had sort of absorbed some of the new gospel and then it gets disseminated down and then reinterpreted, they'll see some like, post something, oh, my back's really hurting. And then from there, you have these stories. If someone's creating content or let's say they're overly catastrophizing, it's like, well, what now is at the repository, at the bottom level of people interpreting what is being said? And to your point, I think it's more a testament of the way that information gets channeled down over time. The other one I was thinking of, you brought up Herman Ponzer, was flexible dieting back in the day, right? Where it all got distilled down into IIFYM, if it fits your macros, where people like non-science, let's say science adjacent bros, when they'd be fielded a question, it's like, what is the simplest way that I could try and convey this information? And it's like, does that actually encapsulate perfectly what someone should advise? And the answer is, of course, no. But a lot of fidelity is lost along the way. So 100%, please continue, man. That was the scene in 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18.
Yeah. We desperately needed someone to champion these ideas, even if they weren't brand new, hot off the presses. They were not making their way into the fitness world. And like you said, everyone was treating the body as if it was some kind of machine where it was like, oh, your knee hurts? It's because your quads are stronger than your hamstrings. Do these 2 things and give it 4 weeks and you'll be good to go. And in reality, no one was thinking like, well, okay, like maybe we should look at, in this athletic training textbook, it talks about how do you help out athletes who are actually in pain. And it has, one of the first things it says is be a good listener. Find out what the problem is. Be aware of body language, project a caring image. This is all the stuff that's going on before it's even saying like, oh, and by the way, we're going to tape that and you need to rehab that muscle with these exercises, right? So I think in fitness, that element was really lacking. The idea that the way that you address something, first of all, you need to figure out what the heck's going on and stop treating the body like a very simple machine. You need to have a very person-centered approach to coaching. Listen, figure out what the problem appears to be, and provide that support, which is not just providing a solution, but is also having some bedside manner and not promoting narratives that may actually be counterproductive in terms of long-term recovery and return to the type of activity that was being done previously. So absolutely, this is a positive movement in fitness. But like I said, there have been some potential misapplications or misinterpretations. I think the first big misapplication is that the new novel fun part of the biopsychosocial model is the psychosocial part, right? And like I said, coaches used to completely ignore pain narratives and bedside manner and what kind of ideas you're kind of planting in the head of your clients when you talk about injury or pain in a certain way. And I think that there was, in the excitement over the psychosocial elements, I think a lot of people seem to have let the bio part kind of disappear. And it's led to some really confusing things where like someone will, seem to like make a post about like, I've been doing this exercise and it really hurts. And then like today I was walking up the stairs and my knee just like totally buckled in pain and I had to grab the handrail. And people will say, what you should not do is modify any activity that you're doing. Instead, you should take a journey inward and think about what you're doing to yourself with all this negative self-talk. And it's tough because when you're critical of that, it sounds like you're being critical of the entire concept of pain narratives having an impact. And as I've already made clear, that's not my viewpoint. But if I have an athlete who's saying, hey, I've been doing, if I have a client who's saying I've been doing this exercise and it hurts like hell, and it's not getting any better, and it's starting to impact activities of daily living, we need to deal with the biological part too, right? Because they were still doing athletic stuff 6 weeks ago, and they weren't hobbling around in chronic pain. So something has changed here, and it's worth being a good listener and finding out what the problem is. Now, you can do that without planting all sorts of catastrophic pain narratives in their head, saying, don't move, put a brace on it, bury it in ice, I'll be over in 20 minutes. You don't have to treat everything like an emergency. But I think it's really fascinating that some people seem to have overcorrected. This Cartesian model was so overly simplistic. Um, you know, disrupt tissue, pain receptors don't like it. They send a totally proportional message to the brain 10 times out of 10, and that's how pain happens. Of course, it's more nuanced than that, but I think it's a little bit unfortunate that some folks appear to have taken one oversimplified model and replaced it with a different oversimplified model that really isn't incorporating the biological element as much as it ought to be. So I think leaning on the biopsychosocial model is only nuanced in nature when you retain the biological element. That is a third of what's going into that model. One of the common things that I see is people getting a little bit too excited about low correlation values between tissue damage and pain. And they kind of use this knowingly or unknowingly to kind of really elbow the bio part out of the biopsychosocial model. And sometimes people will misinterpret, perhaps maybe a lower than expected correlation between tissue damage and pain as a declarative statement that there is no relationship between tissue damage and pain. And it's really important to understand that an inconsistent correlation or a context-dependent correlation is not the same thing as no relationship whatsoever, right? So sometimes when I'll see what kind of references people are using to justify this idea that, there's absolutely no relationship between tissue damage and pain, you'll look into it and you'll see, well, what the study's actually showing is that when people are asked to rate their pain on a subjective numerical scale and they are exposed to the same painful stimulus, they give different numbers. And I don't think that really makes the point that people are trying to take away from it, right? So with any kind of subjective scale, it would be very counterintuitive to assume that somehow, Omar, you and I are both going to be perfectly calibrated to give the exact same number when we're exposed to some kind of pressure stimulus or heat stimulus or whatever stimulus is used to experimentally induce pain. So I don't think we should expect with a subjective scale that any two individuals are going to give the same number. And I, in light of the biopsychosocial model, I also wouldn't expect, to be totally honest, that you, Omar, would give the same number in November and the same number the next June, right? Like I would expect that contextual factors, even if we applied the same stimulus, could very much impact the numerical number that you give for that pain rating. Another area where I see people kind of citing research is related to imaging of the spine, right? And saying like, well, we've got all these people who have abnormalities indicated on their spinal imaging, and they don't report high levels of pain. And then we have these people who have much fewer abnormalities in their spine imaging, but they're reporting higher pain. And I think it's really important to recognize that when you're trying to link any kind of spinal abnormality as observed through imaging to pain, there's a few things to point out. One is that different raters interpret radiological images very differently, it seems. Any kind of imaging that's done, it seems like there is a pretty substantial level of variability from one clinician to another in terms of what they flag as being a clinically relevant abnormality. But more importantly, when it comes to spinal abnormalities, and I want to be really clear here, I'm not an expert in pain science. I'm certainly not a radiologist or a spinal clinician. And so in normal circumstances, I would stay away from a topic where I don't feel like I have bona fide expertise. But in this case, there's no avoiding. Like whether you want to or not, if you are a practitioner or just a person who lifts, you will be dealing with this stuff. So you will have to form an opinion on this whether you want to or not, and you might as well go ahead and think about it before you do. So I don't want to claim any expertise that isn't warranted, but that's why I'm talking about this topic, is because you can say, "Oh, I don't have an opinion about pain." Well, that's fine until you're hurt, and but then you're going to have an opinion either way. But anyway, when it comes to spinal abnormalities, and for example, something like a bulging or herniated disc, one of the really important things that's going to dictate symptoms is where exactly is that bulge or herniation? Are you putting pressure on the root of a nerve or not? And the location, we might find that a very minor bulge in a very unfavorable location induces more pain or leads to more pain than a more sizable bulge or herniation that just happens to occur in a more favorable area where it's not directly interfering with any nerve roots or putting any pressure on nerve roots. So I think one other area where I see people citing research saying, "Hey, look, pain has nothing to do with tissue damage." And again, that's an extreme interpretation of this kind of game of telephone. But I have seen people say, "Well, look at this study," and sometimes they'll be referencing poor correlations between tissue damage and pain, and it's in tissues or areas where we just don't have a high density of nociceptors to actually really relay a high intensity signal of a tremendous amount of pain. A nociceptor density is not uniform across all tissues, and I mean we know that intuitively. If I gave you the option, I am going to make a 1-inch incision somewhere on your body, where would you like it to be? Your answer is not going to be, I don't really care. It's all the same to me, right? Like we happen to know that. And that's all with one tissue, skin tissue. When you start getting into other tissues, nociceptor density gets very, very different from tissue to tissue. So I think it's really important to understand that when you see someone making a claim that feels maybe a little bit outlandish, when they're saying there is absolutely no connection between tissue damage and pain, that's definitely a pretty gross oversimplification, right? And there's certainly a relationship there. Now, an obvious example of this, like I said, we can ignore the psychosocial elements, and we can induce a pain stimulus that causes pain, and we can do it reliably. I don't have to explain to someone, like I said, if you burn skin, that actually could get bad. It could damage the tissue. You could get an infection. You may lose feeling. We may have to do skin grafts. I don't have to explain the context. If I burn someone's hand, it will hurt. And insert any malicious, crazy pain experiment you want to put in there. We don't even have to tell people we're doing it. We can put up a screen. They can't see anything. If I, put the tip of a knife at the bottom of your foot, Omar, it's gonna hurt, and you don't even have the knowledge that I'm doing it, but you can feel that pain. So obviously those are so obvious of examples, they almost don't warrant discussion. But sometimes it's important when you make a claim, you have to say, well, okay, well, what's the most obvious way that I can refute that claim? And if you get 3 examples off the top of your head, it probably means you want to lace a whole bunch of other caveats onto that claim, or maybe walk it back pretty hard. Now, I don't want to make it seem like it's just an overtly preposterous idea about this breakdown of the relationship between tissue damage and pain. Because, for example, there are individuals who have pain of completely idiopathic origin. We do not know of any discernible tissue damage that's underlying this pain, and it's assumed to be psychosomatic in nature, basically meaning, these individuals are experiencing pain driven by a psychologically driven or psychologically originating impetus or stimulus, right? So there will be instances of folks who have pain conditions where they say, I swear this arm is killing me, and we just can't find anything wrong structurally with any of the tissues of that limb, right? So the fact that some of this apparently idiopathic pain, this pain that appears to be psychosomatic in origin, the existence of this type of pain certainly does break down that Cartesian approach where pain is as simple as 3 units of tissue damage equals 3 units of pain, and 7 units of tissue damage equals 7 units of pain. So there is more to pain than meets the eye, but it's important that we don't lose sight of the fact that there are many biological factors that absolutely can drive pain. And the reason it matters is you could make some really irresponsible decisions if you ignore the bio element of the biopsychosocial model. I have heard of many different kind of horror stories, not from individuals, but from like news articles. Usually it's, news articles that people link to when they're trying to sell you insurance for personal trainers. But instances where personal trainers ignore something that a client says, oh, this hurts, that hurts. And they say, you're just being a baby. You're general population, non-athlete. You think everything hurts. We're going to keep pushing. And, inevitably the individual pushes them in a manner that would be totally contraindicated if they had, done what the book says, listen, figure out what the problem is, right? So if we're too quick to label all pain associated with training as some kind of psychosocial or psychosomatic narrative that you're kind of weaving together based on past experience and maybe fiction and kind of drawing it out of thin air, we may overlook really important things that need to be acted upon. And we could run into situations where something that is a 4 or 5 day recovery becomes a 4 or 5 week recovery because we just didn't listen to either our body or the body of our client and the report coming from our client. So I totally understand that it is unfavorable and counterproductive to catastrophize over every little ache and pain. But I would say that as a practitioner, for example, you need to approach this with, I think the way I would frame it is discipline, Omar. When, I'm not coaching people at the moment because I got stuff going on, I'm busy. But, when I had a full roster of clients, it's inevitable. You're going to get people that report, shoulders bugging me, knees bugging me, etc. Every single time I go into it with a tone of conversation that is fairly neutral. So I don't say, oh, I'm sure it's nothing, you're just being a baby, but why don't you tell me what it is, right? Because that's not good either. That's very dismissive, and it hurts the coach-client relationship. You don't want to be dismissive and overconfident that I'm sure it's nothing because you're not actually validating the concerns. And in some cases, the concerns may be very, very real. So you go into it in a very neutral manner and you say, interesting. When did this, when was the first onset of this discomfort? Was it when you were doing any particular exercise? Was it happening during the exercise or hours after the exercise when you noticed the most pain? So you really have to dig in there and figure out what's going on. And in many cases, I will deduce that what we're having here is nothing more than your run-of-the-mill aches and pains of just, hey, sometimes you train and sometimes your patella gets a little sore or your shoulder gets a little sore. So we modify training, we talk about it, and I'm always really careful about my language. And I say, hey, I've heard you out, we've talked through it. Here's what I'm thinking we should do. Let's give that joint a little bit of rest, let it, recover back, get back stronger. So it's always talking about just rest and recovery. It's never talking about something's broken, we got to fix it, or you got a bum shoulder or a bum knee, and then we have no options for fixing. It's all about, oh, okay, I think we threw a little too much at you. Should be, good to go in a few days, but, let's just, switch to a different variation, give it a little breather, and we'll come back to it, hit it harder than ever, right? So all that is to say, biopsychosocial model is fantastic. It's infinitely, better than, the Cartesian model, but you got to make sure that you're not totally ignoring the bio element and jumping straight to the psychosocial. Another overcorrection that I see, Omar, or another kind of assumption that people seem to be jumping to conclusions. I see a lot of folks online who will mention, man, I kind of moved away from barbell squats because I was having a sacrum issue or a knee issue or whatever. Sometimes you'll see people who jump in really quickly and say like, oh man, your fear of this exercise is exacerbating the problem, right? You need to get back on the horse, drop the weight, and drive and drive and drive and keep doing that exercise until you're back to your baseline weight with it. And so it's people just kind of assuming right off the bat, your fear of movement is kind of feeding into that fear avoidance model of pain. And to be clear, the fear avoidance model of pain has some extremely valid applications, but we should be really cautious about, jumping straight to conclusions and assuming that fear of movement is this pervasive issue that is underlying, pain in all these different trainees, and we have no idea what their training history is, and so like you might tell someone, hey, I think your fear of movement is really what's causing the pain here. For all you know, they've been training through an injury for years, right? And when I say training through an injury, what I don't know if there's an official definition that's agreed upon or a consensus. When I talk about training through an injury, I talk about saying, screw it. I'm not modifying a damn thing. I'm going to push through the brick wall until it crumbles, right? When I talk about training around an injury, now I'm talking about making modifications, but still pushing forward, right? So I view training around an injury as very different from just strictly rehabbing an injury, right? So there's training through it, which is I'm not changing anything. I'm just going to pretend it's not a problem and keep driving. Training around it, which is, okay, barbell squats hurt. That's why God made Bulgarian split squats and the deadlifts can stay and we're pushing straight ahead, right? Minor modifications, switching from bilateral stuff to unilateral stuff, switching from barbells to dumbbells. You get the idea. Maybe incorporating more machine work. And then a step down from that even is I'm just going to, do targeted rehab for this injury. And that's going to be the bulk of my training for that particular area of the body. And then of course the step down from that is inactivity, right? So what I think is, and this is not, to be negative, like I've been really fortunate that like really smart, well-intentioned people have reached out to me on various podcasts over the years. I've been talking about these chronic pain issues that I've had, which are, I should clarify, from a nerve entrapment issue that I'm addressing. But I've been talking about these for years, and over the years, a lot of really smart, really well-intentioned people have, offered advice, offered, motivation, hey, hang in there, pulling for you. Maybe you should try this, maybe you should try that. But, I have had people tell me, in certain instances, it's probably your fear of these movements that's really alerting you to be looking out for pain when you're doing them. And that's probably feeding into this vicious cycle. And it's like, but I literally trained through it for 4 years and around it for 3 years, right? So it's when your first 4 years of managing the injury is literally convincing yourself, I'm sure it's fine. I'll keep doing what I'm doing. The fear avoidance model just doesn't really apply in that particular setting, even though it is a completely valid model in certain applications. And again, for someone to mention that to me is certainly not, it doesn't hurt my feelings. I don't take it as, it's all in your head, whatever. That's not what the model suggests. But more importantly, it gets to the idea that it really is critical to dig into someone's history and be a good listener and be a good observer before you, if you're working with a client, for example, before you kind of formulate how the fear avoidance model might feed into a particular uh, pain experience that's been ongoing for a while. So you know, if you're gonna, if you like, for my example, just to make it as concrete as possible, I tried, training straight through it and literally deluded myself into thinking, yeah, it's not a problem. Things go away all the time. This will go away, right? The narrative was optimistic to the point of being stupid. Uh, because guess what? After 2 years, you still did two more. Like that's really just stupid. Like you are beyond optimistic and into delusional at that point. If you think, well, maybe most injuries, you got to train at least 3 years through them and then they go away with no changes, right? Like that's a ridiculous idea. But when you've trained through something for 4 years and around it for three, for example, the fear avoidance model is probably not at the top of the list.
No, Eric, I love hearing this from you, man. And that's why I actually shout out to Ben Escrow. He's someone else who has spoken about his back issues, or I've, given an account here concerning kind of my elbow. And I think some of these conversations are dependent upon the population they're intended for. So like there's a seminar that I saw where, there's participants there and they kind of were just getting into lifting. And when you're first getting into lifting, if you don't have an athletic background, and it's kind of weird, right? Like you'll do a deadlift, like, ooh, my back feels sore. What's going on here? Or you might perform a movement. And so you might experience like non-specific lower back pain. Like you've never done this before and you're deadlifting and all of a sudden, whoa, I feel a pull in my back. And they're wondering, okay, I've never experienced this pain before. Is this supposed to happen? Like, what's wrong with me? And so in those instances, let's say if someone, a population that is not as experienced with lifting weight, to guide them along that process, hey, like pain or the pain you're experiencing is not necessarily a good indicator of something going on, so on and so forth, incredibly valuable. But when you reach kind of like Trexler's point, or I'd say for myself, where I self-identify as an athlete, athletes want to do one thing, and that is continue doing the thing they were doing before. They're really adamant on making progress. And so you come up, if anything, you said a delusion. I just want to echo that, man, that the one thing that didn't kind of resolve myself was my elbow, because I had experienced from my own personal vantage point of many different things, non-specific lower back pain, a few other things like the fibular head kind of near my left knee where something flared up, it went away. So like, first you try and push through it, then you try and modify, and eventually it does seem to resolve itself. So you have this narrative like, oh, guess what? Of course, don't panic when it first occurs. I'm sure we could figure it out. Oftentimes, even if it's something minor, it tends to resolve itself over a long enough time course. So like, I just want to echo you, Trex, that I think these could be powerful narratives, but concerning my elbow, which it turns out I think it's like osteochondritis dissecans, so maybe like a little bone spur, something like that, where I've seen multiple physiotherapists. I cannot straighten out the elbow. They could apply all the pressure they want, all the different interventions. It will not straighten out. It's like it's an actual mechanical issue. Well, Trex, when it first started occurring, of course, what am I going to do? I'm like, it's probably a minor thing. You're a lifter. We're fellow lifters here, very passionate. We've encountered dozens of similar things where something will happen and we'll modify it. And it actually was me trying to push through it that made it worse, because I'm like, okay, I'm not going to avoid doing the movements that I'm doing. It's probably, if anything, regular exposure is a good thing. And then it went from there over like 6 months of it happening 2 or 3 more times. Okay, let me start modifying it. And it's an important conversation I just want to mention, being a lifelong lifter, of like, when do we start changing some of these narratives, or when do we start, adapting to the feedback that we're getting so that we get the outcome that we're desiring? Because I'd say for myself, it started like midpoint 2021. I first noticed in spring of 2021, trained through it, and it happened again like in the fall. It took me about a year, right? And so I think that's a very interesting conversation. Sorry, please continue. Just concerning people who've been lifting for a while, what are the stories we tell ourselves? When do we decide to change things up? And how do we know, in the face of so much uncertainty, what is the best course of action to make?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up because, when you're working with someone who's in like the general population, maybe they do shy away from like all lower body stuff because they had a bad experience. Someone taught them how to squat. It didn't go well. And, maybe they are in that population where they are detraining by not doing any lower body loading to a point that actually is making them more susceptible to lower body and lower back injuries, right? But if you're talking to a lifter and you're trying to use fear avoidance model, and instead of doing barbell back squats, they're doing the hack squat machine and RDLs, this is not a fragile human being just because they switch from one movement to another, right? So you kind of have to take that with a grain of salt. And then another thing that comes to mind is just the mindset of an athlete, right? So a lot of times when we look at these models and we try to apply them without actually understanding someone's history, it's very easy to say, oh, okay, so you're having pain because you got these bad narratives because you're kind of afraid of everything and you're afraid of moving and you're afraid of being hurt. So like, let's try to figure out a way that we can just kind of talk you out of being such a scaredy cat and quit being a baby, right? But like, Omar, you know that I told you that baseball tournament that was 4 weeks after the shoulder separation and broken collarbone? You know what I did?
Oh no. You did
I
it?
said, Coach, move me from shortstop to second base. It's a shorter throw. Big deal. I played that tournament. I played the rest of the season. When I tore the sacroiliac ligament in my back, that was a couple weeks before the season. And they said, well, looks like your season's over. I said who? Throw a needle in there, inject me with whatever you got, and we'll do it. Wrestled the whole season, racked up 3 concussions along the way. So like when you're dealing, it's important to talk to folks and figure out like, are you the kind of person who's planting these really limiting narratives, or, on this kind of distribution of how people approach their training, are you the kind of person who almost is your own worst enemy because you'll train through anything? And a good example of, for someone who's likely to plant a bunch of negative, very self-limiting narratives about prior injuries, you probably don't go from a torn sacroiliac ligament to competing in powerlifting years later, right? You convince yourself, I got a bum back. Squatting and deadlifting isn't in the cards for me, right? My shoulder didn't heal right. Maybe because I was playing baseball 4 weeks after the injury. Who knows? But my shoulder didn't heal it healed fine, but it's not symmetrical. And at this point in my life, there's 2 downsides to that. My bench press is not necessarily painful, but it's asymmetrical. My grip is not nearly symmetrical. My right arm, I grip wider. And if I do certain bicep curl variations, I get tenosynovitis. My bicep tendon gets a little inflamed and it hurts a little bit. Again, biology does matter. If your shoulder is shaped differently and you've got a tendon running through a smaller, gap than it used to have, that can cause pain. But the reason I bring that up is when you're working with someone and trying to create kind of a psychological profile for how they approach pain narratives, it's important to look for some of these clues. If you suspect that it really is, catastrophizing and pain experiences and injury history that's feeding into the current complaints of pain or the current pain experience, one thing you should look out for is, do they have a little story for why they can't do every little exercise in the book because of an injury that happened 15 years ago? More likely than not, when you're talking to the person who says, yeah, I can't do that because of this, and I can't do that because of the other, and I can't do that because of the other, that it's very possible that those are valid limitations that they should not be training through and should instead be training around. But it also could be an indicator that this is the type of person who, once they sustain an injury, they say, that's a bad joint, that's a bad body part, and that thing ain't getting better ever, right? And so it's really important to, just like with every other element of coaching, if you're working with someone or if you're talking with your training partner and you're trying to figure out if you should, as a training partner, you're the one who's either telling them to push harder or to pull back most of the time, right? And so it's important to kind of get to know people on a kind of put together a little bit of a psychological profile based on some of those indicators And it might lead you toward how exactly should we be appropriately applying maybe the fear avoidance model or the biopsychosocial model. And in what cases is it just like, oh, your shoulder hurts? Maybe push it a little too hard, misgrooved a few reps. Let's give it a rest, train around it, come back to it in a few weeks. Sometimes that's all you got to do. But that does bring me to kind of my final kind of related misapplication, I would say, of some of these narratives. And it's really common for people to kind of assume, you're experiencing pain right now because you've got messed up narratives. Your pain narratives are all out of whack. You don't have to modify your training. You don't have to take a couple ibuprofen. You need to pop open that skull of yours and do some work in there and figure out how to not feel that pain. Tell yourself a better story. I see people apply that way too much to like very acute pain. It makes a lot more sense in the context of chronic pain in most cases. So sometimes people overlook some very obvious things. Like for me, my bicep tenosynovitis, it's the bio part. Like it's repeatable. If I do certain variations, it hurts. If I do the other variations, it doesn't. It's great. I can train around it, no problem. It doesn't bother me in any way. There's about 150 ways to curl a dumbbell or a cable or a barbell or whatever you prefer, right? So I think sometimes people jump to that a little too quickly in instances of very straightforward acute pain that can be attributed to a very obvious thing. And one of the biggest points in terms of misapplying this concept is that I think there are major misperceptions or misunderstandings about what a good pain narrative looks like.
Yeah.
So, I've seen instances on the internet where someone will maybe do a long push. Omar, you know that even if you're injured, if you're a lifter, you love talking about yourself and saying, things aren't going well, but here's where I'm at. Here's where I've been. Here's where I'm going. I want to thank my team. I want to thank God and country. I want to thank, you know how it goes, especially you're recapping a powerlifting meet. Oh boy. I mean, it's talk about what time you woke up, you do the whole thing, right? But I've seen people who basically say like, yeah, man, sustained an injury a couple weeks before the meet, really frustrated by it, but no big deal. I'll be back at it next week and should be back to full strength any day, right? And I'll see people comment as if that's not a good narrative. Like, oh, you're kind of acknowledging that you're having this pain and it's interfering with your ability to train and perform, and you probably ought to work on that. It's like this is not a person who is a bad pain narrative is like, I don't squat because I have bad knees, right? And most of the time you say, what do you mean by bad knees? And it's like, well, if I run too much, sometimes my patellas get sore. That's not really bad knees, is it? Right? That's just having knees. Like, it's if I haven't been running and I run a lot, my patellas hurt, right? So a bad pain narrative is usually something that is, very self-limiting and usually makes a mountain out of a molehill based on some type of injury history. So for, another, like I said previously, a bad pain narrative for me would be, oh, I can't squat or deadlift. I've had sacrum problems, or I shouldn't be doing barbell benches. I got a bum shoulder, right? And you find ways to train around it, train through it, whatever you got to do. But a really good pain narrative is acknowledging I did sustain an injury. When I hurt my knee squatting, I'm not going to tell myself I didn't hurt my knee squatting. I had 405 pounds on my back. I was coming out of the hole. My knee buckled and I hit the deck and something popped. That's an injury, Omar. I don't know what to tell you, man. And believe it or not, that's going to hurt when you have a knee buckle pop and then you kind of collapse with 4 plates on your back, right? So telling yourself good pain narratives is not about being delusional. It's about saying, okay, that sucks. And if you're an athlete and getting hurt doesn't suck, that's weird. It should suck. You should be frustrated in many cases, or it's at least very natural to be frustrated, to be discouraged in the short term. But it's a totally healthy and normal pain narrative to say, I have pain now because the injury just happened. I feel optimistic that I'm going to be able to recover, rehab, get back to full strength, and my best athletic days are in front of me, not behind me. That is a completely healthy pain narrative. Another completely healthy pain narrative, which I have, this is kind of how I would frame what I'm doing now. You might say, for now, I have very modified training, but I'm going to keep rehabbing until I can work to some more recognizable progressions of squat and deadlift. I'm going to keep working those progressions until I can get to the types of movements that I really enjoy training. And I have full confidence that down the road, however long it takes, a year, 2 years, whatever, I'm going to be back in a spot where I feel very strong and feel very comfortable going into the gym and doing a wide range of squat and deadlift variations with heavy external loads. That's a completely healthy pain narrative. And every now and then I'll see people who are saying things like that on social media, and people will be like, "Oh, dude, you got to clean that up. You're planting all these negative seeds in your head." And I think sometimes it appears to me that a lot of folks, and I'm sure people are going to listen to this and say, "Oh, you're straw manning these arguments." And you know what? If these things never happen, great. Then that means there's one less thing to worry about. But I do think that people do have a tendency to perhaps misinterpret completely normal and neutral to positive pain narratives as being negative in nature, just because they simply acknowledge some pretty basic truths about where that person is at that point in time. And the thing about pain narratives is it's really more about, is your pain narrative reflecting self-efficacy, confidence? Do you believe that you are capable of implementing a plan that will get you back to where you want to be in the future? And if your narrative is compatible with that, then I think you're doing about as good as you can do in terms of a pain narrative. If you truly believe, I've got a plan in place, and at the appropriate time, I'm going to execute that plan on an appropriate timeline. And if I do execute that plan, which I certainly can do easily, well, not easily, but I know I'm capable of it, that is going to bring me to where I want to go. Now, the thing that gets really tricky is, what if there are really good reasons that where you want to go shouldn't be where you were before the injury, right? So I've a great example of that is like severe traumatic spinal injuries. Sometimes people say, hey, you're not getting back into this sport. Like, we're going to have to fuse vertebrae. You can't be doing the kind of contact that you're used to doing once we fuse those vertebrae, whatever the case may be. I'm not a spinal surgeon. Cat's out of the bag. I don't like to put myself down like that, but I'm not. But there are credible instances where people say, hey, there's a term for it, Omar, career-ending injury. They happen, right?
Yeah.
And the more that you get away from fitness and get into the world of elite sport, the more that you have to start wrestling with these realities, right? There are career-ending injuries in certain activities. That's where the pain narratives get a lot trickier, right? Because now the narrative cannot be, I'm going to get back to where I was. Maybe I'll be better than ever. It's going to have to be, I'm adjusting to a very different reality of what my ceiling is in terms of how, at least in terms of that particular activity, right? So the question is, do you shift your focus to a modified version? Do you shift your focus to a different endeavor entirely and say, okay, because of this injury, I really shouldn't be doing this and that. Therefore, I'm going to put all my energy and time in athletic pursuits towards something totally different. But it's going to, I'm going to have a healthy, functioning, pain-free body that does what I train it to do. And I think that's every bit as healthy in terms of a kind of pain narrative. So I think I want to wrap up here. I've talked about some misconceptions about pain. I think I'd like to maybe provide a reasonably constructive way to think about pain via metaphor. So I think with pain, it's interesting that there are these psychosocial factors that influence our pain experience, and sometimes they kind of work as an on-off switch. Sometimes they work more as like a volume up and down switch. And sometimes different factors can take our attention away from it entirely and very much impact our perceived pain experience. So, as someone who's done podcasting for a long time, I think the easiest thing for me to think of is putting a microphone in a room and attaching it to an amplifier where you can turn it up and down, how much, how powerful that microphone is in terms of drawing out all the noise of the room, right? So at a normal volume on the amplifier, the room seems quiet, right? No big deal. There's nothing happening in the room. Nobody's talking. Seems quiet. You're not feeling any pain. That's kind of the metaphor. Now, if you have a variety of mood-related issues, right? So perhaps maybe you're feeling some depressive symptoms, some anxiety symptoms. Maybe you have the expectation of pain. Those things can basically turn up the volume knob on that amplifier. And so now in a situation where there perhaps may not have been noticeable or discernible pain, perhaps we turn that up so much that now the microphone is capturing the sound of the air conditioning unit humming and, the floorboards kind of creaking, or all these ambient noises that we normally tune out. But because of these predisposing psychosocial factors, we're more tuned into that. And what normally wouldn't really register and catch our attention as a pain signal, because that volume's cranked up by those predisposing factors, now that signal is really picking up, and we're starting to notice that either because of our attentional focus on it, our expectation effects, or a variety of other mood related things. Because like we said, pain is influenced by past experience, by emotion. It's very multifaceted, and these things can turn up the volume and take what would have been no pain or very minimal pain to a much higher level of pain that we're perceiving. Similarly, we may have a particular kind of baseline level of pain that's discernible but not too bad. And if we just simply, for example, get distracted or go from a very poor mood state to a much more positive mood state, we may find that the volume on that amplifier gets turned back down. And what used to be, a moderate or more discernible pain stimulus actually isn't really registering as nearly as painful as it used to be, right? So there are all these different factors that can modify the intensity of a pain perception or the experience of pain, and they don't necessarily, there are these biopsychosocial factors that are all interlinked here. And then one thing that's really fascinating about pain, let's say you've got a noisy air conditioning unit and you've got that amplifier turned up, you can hear that crappy thing humming. And, someone walks into the room with a giant stereo and they're just blasting super loud music, right? The new Mastodon album, or, what's another band I like? Tool, some noisy stuff. But they're blaring this music, and believe me, you forgot that the air conditioning unit's doing a little bit of humming, right? This bigger, more impactful stimulus has taken your attention completely away from that noise. The noise is still there, right? Those nociceptors are still interacting with whatever noxious stimulus was there. But, there are certainly things that can completely override some of these mild and even very severe instances of pain. In the most extreme cases, you hear about people who are in a war zone and they're under fire and they're running, and they get out of the acute danger and they say, "Ooh, that was close." And then they realize they were shot, right? And it's because that fight or flight response was such a massive, high amplitude distraction from that pain experience in the acute moment that there's no question. Tissue damage, you got shot in this scenario, Omar. Tissue damage occurred, and it's going to hurt eventually, right? Once that acute fight or flight response wears off. So again, that's not evidence that there's no relationship between tissue damage and pain, but it is evidence that pain is very complex. It's very nuanced and multifaceted, and there can be stimuli that are so extreme in nature that they completely divert your attention for a short period of time away from a very robust pain stimulus. So pain is fascinating, and I think it's very important that we retain the nuance and complexity when we discuss it. And once again, I want to acknowledge a few things. I am not, the purpose of this episode is not to critique and point fingers and say everybody's getting it wrong, but it is to hopefully steer some conversations about pain because, you know, even the people that aren't saying some of these things, like I'm sure there are a lot of people who are just browsing around in different online fitness spaces and they hear something and say, well, that can't be right. It seems like you're telling me, even if I'm misinterpreting you, it seems like you're telling me that there's no relationship between tissue damage and pain. And I can't really live in a world where that's on the table. Like it doesn't really match my lived experience in any capacity whatsoever. And so I think hopefully rather than pointing fingers or being dismissive or, you know, downplaying any credible models of pain, my hope is to maybe provide a little bit more clarity for people who are interacting about these topics and engaging with these topics, and especially people who are wrestling with these topics in a way that is causing some degree of confusion or cognitive dissonance, or like, okay, I get this biopsychosocial model, but I'm hearing people talk about it in a way that makes no sense at all to me. My goal with this episode was to be more clarifying than combative, certainly not trying to point any fingers, call people out. And to the extent that any of my examples feel like they're straw man arguments and you're saying no one's actually saying that out there, like I said, if my thumb is completely off the pulse of the fitness world and I've hallucinated these observations, all the better, because that means that there's no need to clarify in the first place. But the fact that we felt compelled so many years ago to do a pain roundtable, I think probably gets to the root of the issue, which is that there are many, many misconceptions about injury, pain, tissue damage, all these different topics in fitness. And I think it's good to kind of hash out where these models agree, where they disagree, how we can apply them, and how sometimes they get oversimplified, misstated, or in some cases even misapplied.
Rex, I knew you were going to do it. This is why they, once again, capital T, try to silence you, because I think that roundtable would have been a lot shorter. I don't think we would have taken 40 minutes to agree. And I don't even think we agreed upon a working definition of pain. But I think the entire conversation would have been shorter. I think the space would have been better. I'm glad we are finally discussing it. Just to actually steelman you, when you gave some of those examples, I think exceptionalism sometimes plays a role in the sense that until it happens to you, it might not be real. And so I've had so many different scenarios, and this is why I want to give credit to people that have been lifting for a while, that, once again, I kind of said that like I self-identify as an athlete. Most athletes, I'd say like 90% at least of athletes that I interact with, when you train with them and you just say right out of the gate, like Trex, hey, like, oh, let's do this movement. I'm like, let's say, oh, I don't want to do that. My elbow, completely fair. So like, oh, hey, you're catastrophizing that. Like every single athlete has a large, once again, repository of experiences, and they know they have that empathy of understanding. And one of my proudest moments, actually, shout out to Helms, is that we had done, this is 2019, it was during his prep, we did a little like Moss wrestling the day before. So I had a flight, so already my back kind of gets a little achy. We did some squats and some deadlifts. That sort of set it off, did the Moss wrestling, and then from there, my back was irritated where, it was more difficult for me to walk and so on and so forth. And Helms was very understanding. But someone, once again, that had sort of, let's say, what they perceived, what had been distilled down to them as it's related to pain science, saw me walking with Helms at this gym. And someone said, dude, and like this person was like, dude, don't catastrophize. Like, what are you doing, right? And then their best advice, which I loved, was walk it off. So, and Helms, this is a proud friend moment of Helms having my back, just eviscerated this dude, not in like a mean way, but like Helms being the science inquisitor. He's like, well, what do you mean by that? And so I think it's always interesting, to your point, that all of our experiences are different, and it's important to validate them. Like, I'll just give one other quick example, which no one was malicious in saying this, but I was training with someone who was considerably younger than me. I was like maybe like 27, 28 at the time. This person was like 20, right? And we're warming up tricks on tricep extensions. And I just said, I got to take my time on this. I have to warm up. My elbows get angry. And he said, bro, he said, don't even think about that stuff. It's like, just work through it. It's like, that's your body lying to you. And I was like, like in my head, I was like, I don't even know how to begin. How do I broach this conversation? So no, unfortunately, Trex, I think your examples, I just wanted to give a few of those short ones, are completely within the realm of possibility. If anything, they might be a little bit more positive than some of the ones that listeners might experience when they're in the gym environment in different gym populations. So, no, man, I think you did a fantastic job. Is there anything, I think you also wrapped it up neatly, anything you want to say in closing before we end the episode?
Yeah, a couple weeks ago, we did an episode. It was a big sob story about how I had all these bad narratives about my hip and sacrum and all that stuff. I have a ilioinguinal nerve entrapment, and I wanted to report back that I've been getting really serious about physical therapy. It's going quite well. I think it's in the best place it's been in a long time, and to the extent that it's helpful to folks, I think it has been really helpful to, getting back to that idea of, do we train through things? Do we train around them? I think when it comes to rehab, there are some injuries where you really have to get some things moving, and I think for someone who's got, the type of nerve entrapment I have, you might be a little nervous about getting the sacrum moving around a little bit. You might want to keep everything really tight. And it's actually been really helpful to just embrace movement using exercises and ranges of motions that are appropriate for where I'm at in my recovery. So again, it's that idea of, there are ways to move things and embrace movement and not fear movement, and to do those things in a progressive manner so that you can build your way back up to where you want to be. And shying away from movement is certainly not always the answer, and in fact is in many cases rarely the answer. It really just depends on the exact thing that you're trying to recover from. But going back to my man Bill Prentice that wrote this textbook, wonderful examples in here of these narratives. I was just flipping through them. I was hurt, and now I'm going to do my best to get well. Every day I'm getting better. The athletic trainers are doing their best for me. I'm hurt, but because of my good fitness level, I know I'm going to recover quickly. I plan to do everything I'm told to facilitate this recovery. These are quotes from 2011 in the textbook. And folks, pain narratives, they do matter, but it's important to be able to recognize a good one when you see one. And sometimes it does mean embracing, hey, right now, I got the whole sob story going on, but I'm rehabbing. I'm feeling better than I was a couple weeks ago, feeling way better than I was a couple weeks before that. And usually that's what this looks like when it's done in a way that is tethered to reality, but not layered with, catastrophizing and things like that. So for the folks who have reached out since that episode and helped me plan my funeral and all sorts of things like that, I appreciate the support. I appreciate the love. I'm doing well. And watch out, folks, because I'll be back at it before you know it, taking all your medals at the powerlifting and bodybuilding competition. So if you were thinking about competing, you might want to go ahead and do that now.
I love it, man. I love it. I just want to say in closing, Trex, that was a wild story about your coach saying, hey, you know what, or the athletic trainer is like, hey, just like your bone is, you broke your collarbone. Absolutely wild.
Yeah.
But one of the best, I think that's like the best example you could have opened up this episode with.
Yeah, to be clear, not that it's relevant to the actual premise, but I was like, my freshman year, I wrestled in the 119-pound weight class, right? I lifted from the age 12, right? So I think this happened when I was 15. I was buffer than everybody I knew, permanently lean, like pretty doggone shredded for like a 15-year-old. When a 15-year-old with minimal body fat breaks their collarbone and separates their shoulder,
You can
it's
see it.
not hard to tell. A clavicle shouldn't come together like that, and like looking back at it, I'm just like, who was this person? Like, is it possible that I just found a stranger passing by and thought they were the trainer? But things were different back then. Liability didn't exist. No harm, no foul. We all moved on. I got a good story out of it.
Things were better back then. You see, you picked yourself up, Trex, by the bootstraps. You said, I'm not going to let this limit me. You played baseball in that tournament 4 weeks later, and what you left out, I believe, you guys won, of course, right?
That tournament, yeah, we did quite well.
Oh,
Yeah, we did quite well in that tournament, which put us into a different tournament, which we got stomped.
okay.
We had the great misfortune. We were from Ohio, and so around Ohio, we were big shots,
Yeah.
right? But from doing well all season, we kind of got entered into this like big tournament down south. And the thing about the South is it's warm, and so you can play baseball like all year. Can't do that in Ohio. So basically, like these kids had like a decade of extra experience on us just because they play 11, 12 months a year. And we basically, when it's like warm enough to hit with an aluminum bat and not feel the bones in your hands rattling, we get like a good 4 months of baseball in every year. But anyway, they moved me over to second base, but I will admit, like my coach, he pulled me aside multiple times and he's like, "Hey, dude, you're playing fine. Like running the bases well, hitting well, fielding well." But he said, "I need you to not show the amount of discomfort that you're showing because I look like an idiot putting you out there." So he was like, "If you keep playing the way you're playing, I'm fine with it. But I need you to, practice some stoicism here, and I need to not see that you're in discomfort because otherwise these parents they're gonna give me hell for this. Like I can't be putting out kids who are like in agony." So, but no, the tournament went quite well, and it's a short throw from second base, no big deal.
I love it. I love that. That's the end of it. So when you're making the Disney movie, it's like, so did not know you had the injury, playing football. Oh man, maybe my summer's over. Baseball, come back. You win the first tournament and you just see the best part about any
End it
story.
there.
It's just where you end it. So you end the story there, Trex, and now you got a Disney movie. It's like, I was thinking about
Yeah.
this real quick and then we'll wrap it up. There's a boxer I cannot, and that's why I talk about like exceptionalism. For every single time someone's been told you cannot do this, you will find that one example. There's a boxer where he had like a nerve, spinal, like a cervical injury, and the doc told him you're never going to box again. And like it became like a motivational movie and all this stuff. It's like, that's the thing, doc, you don't know me. It's like, but for every single person that says that, there's probably only like 5%, I don't know the amount, that actually are able to come back. But we will focus and amplify that exception of the person that was able against all odds, because we love comeback story, the hero story, overcoming adversity, all those sorts of things.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you know me, I love a good movie. So
Yes.
keep cranking them out.
Just keep recommending them. Man, I will say I want to thank every single person for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. You could go ahead and leave a rating and review like Mark the Asian Atheist did, that was 5 stars, that I think even Eric Helms would be pleased by. We are back every single uncertain date here from now until the end of time. We'll catch you in that next episode.